The second day's event begins with a welcome from Stephen. Bruce Klingner and Professor Lee are joined by Sue Mi Terry, Senior Fellow for Korea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The discussion turns to the future of democracy in South Korea and the contrast of and concerns about North Korea. The nature and development of Korea's democracy is tightly bound to notions of ethnicity, nationalism, Confucianism, and unification. The speakers dive into these concepts and more, assigning particular weight to the relationship between the contemporary polity and the security complications emanating from Korea's geostrategic realities. And now, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us here today. We're delighted to have some of you back and some new faces in the audience, and welcome to those who are live streaming. We did have a rather large live streaming audience yesterday, and we're very happy for those who are joining via audio podcast or watching via YouTube video. We're doing a special recording session here to mark the 30th anniversary since the passing from the military authoritarian regime in South Korea to South Korea as a flourishing democracy. And we think that's important, and we think it's important relative to the tie-in to the Olympics. We hope you're enjoying the 23rd Winter Games. And we know that this is a process that is very complex. It was a vibrant session yesterday. It was interesting and multi-layered, and we encourage those of you who were not here or who are just joining us electronically to turn back to the first part of the discussion as well. Today I have on our days Bruce Klingner from the Heritage Foundation, Professor Sung-Yoon Lee from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and Dr. Sue Terry with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we will look this morning a bit further into Korea's democracy, especially vis-a-vis the United States-Korea relationship. There was some detail yesterday given to the level of U.S. support for the democratic process back in 1986 and 87. We'll continue on that note. We'll also discuss a bit more about the North Korea angle relative to South Korea democracy, and specifically a question that was raised from the floor about whether there's a certain appeal or vulnerability within the South Korean policy associated with democracy relative to the North, and if there's an appeal by the North that maybe penetrates in a way that's worthy of examination. And we'll also look perhaps a bit back more historically to the development of Korean democracy relative to other regional realities, especially Korea's growth relative to Japan's embrace of democracy, and Korea perhaps doing it one better in terms of the democratic process and how it saw that evolve. And so we have really a swath of modern historical questions that we can delve into, and certainly the contemporary. And so these three sterling analysts will help us here. One of the things that those of us who were on the days yesterday were able to share were some personal recollections about that time. So we thought we'd open this morning by turning to Sue, who's just joining us, and asking her, what are her thoughts about the process in 87, any personal recollections, or what you make looking at it as an analyst in terms of that all-important transition?
Well, in terms of personal recollections, I grew up in Korea actually during the Park Chung-hee years in the 70s. So I still remember, even as an elementary student, school student, there was some curfew because my mother was a single mother. There was some curfew. There was some, and I think we left after the Gwangju uprising in 1980. And I just remember the next time I really went to Korea, which was like around that period. I was visiting Korea with my mother, and then I went back to Yonsei University in junior year as a study abroad program. And I remember when I landed at Yonsei University, the first thing I smelled was actually a tear gas, and I was not familiar with that. But that's whole part of very active movement that the students were working. Like students brought democracy in Korea, along with professors and all the public. But it's the whole transition is pretty remarkable. We always talk about economic development, how miraculous that is, right? We have $67 per capita GDP in the aftermath of the Korean War, and it was now, 35,000 over. We always talk about the miracle of economic development in South Korea, but not the democratization is incredible that this was achieved in our lifetime, in one's lifetime. But my span of that recollection is from the Park Chung-hee years, from going back to that whole arriving at Yonsei as part of and watching the students thriving in this democratic movement. So I thought it's pretty remarkable when you look back. Yeah.
And how do you see it relative to the broader embrace in Korea-U.S. relations and two democracies that are also two allies?
Well, I also think it's complicated in a way, right? Sort of democratization in South Korea and U.S.-Korea relations in that way, because, to be frank, there is a generation of Koreans who do also think, and I think we need to talk about this frankly, that U.S. I don't know what your discussion was like yesterday, but there are a generation of Koreans who also think that U.S. in a way sometimes impeded. There are people who think that the process of democracy in Korea, that Koreans were able to achieve democracy, not with the support of the Americans, but necessarily sometimes, but despite of U.S. supporting the authoritarian leaders from Seungman Rhee to Park Chung-hee to Chun Doo-hwan and so on. And we just talked briefly about Gwangju uprising, but the controversial role the U.S. may or may not have played in the Gwangju uprising. And all of that, I do think, is underneath the surface of U.S.-Korea alliance that we do have to kind of address, because it does, and it needs careful alliance management, because time to time we see it sort of when it kind of explodes, like in 2002 with the unfortunate accident when the American soldiers ran over two 14-year-old South Korean girls. And then American soldiers were found innocent, or it was not a guilty verdict, and sort of that what led to huge demonstrations. Or in 2008, when I guess it was Lee Myung-bak who lifted the ban on U.S. beef imports, and that led to huge candlelight vigils and demonstrations. So time to time, then Americans are always caught surprise, saying, where is this coming from? Because we're not really examining sort of, what's been always underneath sort of this complicated history and relationship in terms of U.S.-Korea relations and democracy. So I think this is something that we need to explore and talk about it more frankly.
No, well, thank you, Sue, because we actually didn't get into that part yesterday. We did talk a bit about American support at the critical juncture for the democratic movement. But you're right on that, and it recalls something that I heard in my classes up in Cambridge in the years after Gwangju in one class, where basically the professor said, look, Gwangju is a watershed. The Americans were held out as the standard bearer, the aspirational before. And after that, it raised doubts about the United States in the minds of those, not only of the democratic movement, but the general public.
Right. So I think there is a sense that at least for a certain generation of South Koreans, that U.S. is always looking out for U.S. interests, that we're overly focused on stability or countering communism in the Cold War era. That's why we continue to support authoritarian rulers, and we're not really helpful during this process. And you sort of add the historical sense of U.S. sort of doing whatever it needs to do for its interests, starting from the Taft-Katsura Agreement in 1905 that led to U.S. leaving with agreement with Japan and sort of abandoning Korea, or U.S. being responsible for the division of the Korean Peninsula, to the U.S.'s role in the Gwangju uprising. So this is kind of all underneath the surface of U.S.-South Korea alliance, which is strong, which is enduring. There's a strong security alliance. But I do think there's these deeper layers that needs to be explored. And always, I think that's why alliance management is, you have to carefully manage this. Otherwise, that's why we see incidents like 2002 and 2008, and it comes up time to time.
Mm-hmm. It's worth noting that we had a very good session with David Straub on his book on anti-Americanism in Korea, and we recommend that as well as the podcast for those of you interested. Sue, how does that overlay then with the current situation, with the concerns about Korea passing and the management of the Korea-U.S. relationship?
I think it's related. I mean, Koreans are obviously very concerned about Korea passing whatever. Every time, it's always kind of the fear is between abandonment and entrapment, right? So of course that's a concern. That some, even with North Korea, there's always this concern where U.S. then sometime one day make a deal with China and bypass South Korea. I do think the U.S. administration is now rightfully understand that they even know what phrase Korea passing is all about. They understand that Korean government and Korean people are very sensitive to that, that you need to always continue to consult and have a close working relationship and coordination with the Koreans.
Bruce, I see you nodding there.
I'll agree with so much of what Sue said. Is just picking up on an earlier point, though, where some South Koreans saw the U.S. alliance and the presence of U.S. forces as an impediment to democracy. The U.S. view would be that the alliance and our presence there was the shield behind which South Korea was able to develop first economically and then have the democracy take root. So, we would see it as the shield, the protection against the threat from the north, and then that enabled democracy to take root. And also, as Sue pointed out, the fear of abandonment and entanglement is one that has, I think, always been there, and perhaps even more strongly now. As North Korea nears completion of its ability to hit the American homeland with nuclear weapons, I feel that I'm hearing that even more strongly expressed when I travel to South Korea. That fear of, when we hear of preventive attack options being discussed by the Trump administration, there's that fear that we are going to drag Korea into a war that they don't want. And also at the same time, a fear of abandonment that, the phrase that I hear often is, would the U.S. really trade or risk Los Angeles for Seoul? And I push back and say, well, we were willing to risk an estimated 100 million casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in essence, risking LA, New York, and Washington for Bonn, Paris, and London. And I also point out that we have a mutual defense treaty. It's if we were to renege on that, then the U.S. resolve and dedication to our allies would be called into question, not only throughout Asia but also throughout Europe. And also we have presidential statements and Secretary of Defense statements of affirmation. And then, as I point out, as we've deployed our most precious resource, our sons and daughters in uniform, to the peninsula as well as Japan, which is really the ultimate guarantor that we will be there for Korea. So, Korea fears that we won't risk LA for Seoul, but that we will risk Seoul for LA. So I think right now is a time of concern, not only because of the growing North Korean threat, but questions about U.S. policy and U.S. resolve or U.S. willingness to put our homeland defense over the interests or the defense of our allies.
Given that, let's spend a few minutes talking about decision-making in these two great democracies. Clearly, it's a messy thing in some ways, right? Because in both Washington and Seoul, we have a fair amount of division now and a fair amount of discord. It leaves Americans uncertain at times. I think, at least in the U.S. administration, some concerns about the current administration in Seoul. It leaves many Koreans scratching their head, like many others in the international community, trying to figure out what are the signals and how decisions are made in Washington, especially in the Trump White House and relative to state and the national security apparatus. So, how do you digest decision-making in these democracies?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of confusion. Those of us in Washington who follow this full time, we're confused at times by what the U.S. administration's policy is on North Korea. There's a lot of contradictory statements, and we debate amongst ourselves as to whether it's a part of a comprehensive good cop, bad cop strategy, sending signals of sort of the Nixon madman theory of if your opponent feels you may attack, then they will be more compliant. And others see it more as kind of disjointed different viewpoints, if not factions, within the administration. So if those of us who follow it full time are confused, we can only imagine how our allies or our opponents are viewing it. And I've had many South Korean and Japanese visitors during the past year who were asking, what is the U.S. policy, or what do you think the U.S. will do? So it's really been a great topic of discussion and debate. And similarly, when Moon Jae-in was running for office and then elected, the U.S. has concern and a bit of confusion about what his policies are or will be. And we see that now with, how far will Moon go in his engagement with the North? What is he willing to offer? Will he try to do what his progressive predecessors did, or will he see that those did not go well, those efforts, so that he needs to stay closely aligned with the U.S.? That's a topic for debate. In looking at Moon Jae-in's North Korea policy, it's much more centrist than I had expected. Given that he was from the progressive side of the spectrum, that he had been chief of staff to Roh Mi-hyun, there was questions as to whether it would be sort of sunshine policy 2.0. And in the run-up to the election, when I would meet with South Koreans, some would say, look, the situation is different. There's a very strong support for the alliance. There's great skepticism about engaging with the North. Even if Moon wanted to be as leftist as people feared, it's as if a wall had been built. He couldn't go as far left as even if he wanted to. And then I'd share that analogy with other South Koreans, and they'd kind of chuckle and say, well, you're so naive. If there's a wall, he will jump over it, he will dig under it. So there was confusion in South Korea as well. But perhaps because North Korea acted as badly to him as to his conservative predecessors, it drove him more to the center. So he reversed his policies on THAAD and Kaesong and sort of pressure before engagement. So I think right now, even if we're debating amongst ourselves and have some questions or concerns as to how far President Moon might go in engagement, at least we're starting from a very good place. The alliance, I think, right now is in very strong, situation and shape. So we both have concerns, we both have questions about each other, but I think we're starting from a very good place. And when I was in Seoul a few weeks ago, all the officials I met with, were very emphatic in saying that the military exercises were simply postponed, they weren't canceled, and that they're very aware of the history of engaging with North Korea. So, in the think tank world, it's our job to think of things that can go wrong. But I think right now, at least, we're in a very good place with the alliance.
I agree with what Bruce said. First, but regarding the Trump administration, whether they're playing bad cop, good cop, there's a lot of confusion. I do think, honestly, this administration is, in terms of policy coordination, it's a little bit lacking. Just you can tell with Secretary Tillerson when he made that speech at the Atlantic Council saying that he's willing to meet with North Koreans without precondition, could be over square table, circle table, whatnot. And he got immediate pushback from the White House and even his own State Department spokesperson. And that was not coordinated, obviously. And usually under, having worked under the Bush administration and Obama administration, usually these kind of policies much more closely coordinated. So there's an extra confusion coming out of the administration just because I think the coordination level, it's not what it used to be or what it should be. Regarding the Moon administration, I also agree, and I was actually much more concerned before he was elected. I don't know if I testified with you, I testified expressing that concern, but I do think that he proved to be much more centrist and pragmatic. I think South Korea is now different. That I think it's kind of, even if he has a summit with Kim Jong-un, I think it's going to be hard to repeat the kind of dynamics that occurred in 2000 with President Kim Dae-jung. The Moon administration keeps saying that they've learned from the Roh Mi-hyun years and Kim Dae-jung years, and I think there is a domestic constraint too. It's evident over just the backlash, even over the Olympics, over walking on the unified flag, or even over the female hockey team. It didn't only come from the conservatives, from the younger generation who thought it was unfair and this and that. So I think it's a different domestic environment that the South Korean government is now having to deal with. So I think in terms of that gives some sort of constraint to the Moon government in terms of how much they can really work give in terms of unilateral concessions to North Korea. So there's a domestic constraint, and I'm sure there is also sort of extra calculation that goes in dealing with the United States and this particular Trump administration.
Professor Lee, democracies and decision-making, where do we find ourselves?
When I imagine the past 100 years or so of Korean resistance, and of course, resistance, demonstration are essential components of democracy. But before the advent of democracy in the Korean Peninsula, going back to the late 19th century, the so-called Donghak movement, Eastern Learning Movement, which was basically an internal uprising against the monarchy. But the tenor of that movement was strong nationalism and xenophobia, fear and hatred toward the foreigner. Starting from there and going on to the anti-Japanese righteous army movements in the early 20th century, the organized independence movement under the leadership of the Korean Provisional Government, the government in exile, later under Kim Koo. And then in the post-45 period, Korean resistance against the announcement of a 5-year, 4-party trusteeship in late December 1945, to the student uprising against Syngman-rhee, and to more recent movements like the anti-beef row. The leitmotif, the recurring theme I find, is strong ethnic nationalism. Of course, an urge to redress moral grievances, transgressions, but also strong ethnic nationalism. And I think, besides Bruce and Sue and some others, policymakers in America, in Washington, I feel, underestimate or don't really get it, don't really understand how strong ethnic nationalism and how it can morph into policy, how the Korean desire to be independent of big power chauvinism, to borrow a term from Kim Il-sung, how the Korean people see ethnic commonality, this shared past and the sense of being together in the future, how this is such a potent force in both domestic politics and in foreign policy. I don't think Americans have a true appreciation for that. Thus, oftentimes, the US underestimates the Korean street, the Korean sentiment, and pays for it. When you look at Japan, for example, for at least a generation following the US occupation of Japan, 1945 to 1952, there was the myth that held currency that Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, had saved Japan and had brought democracy to Japan. I use the word myth to underscore the point, not that it's completely baseless, but it's an exaggerated image of the contribution made by MacArthur, the individual. You could say perhaps never had a single American individual held so much power over so many people for so long as MacArthur did, but in insisting that the emperor not be punished, in bullying Washington to provide food to the hungry nation that was Japan in those very lean post-1945 years, MacArthur laid the foundation of Japan's reconstruction, and the United States was very generous in giving to Japan, giving $2 billion almost, virtually the annual budget for those years. What I'm trying to get at is the Japanese perhaps have an exaggerated sense of the role of MacArthur and the United States in steering Japan in the right direction in the post-45 period, whereas in South Korea, as it was mentioned by Sue, there is this lingering dependence mentality, skepticism toward the role of the United States, a sense of angst, frustration, even a sense of betrayal that the US did not do more. Although when you think about it, the US did a lot in liberating the Korean Peninsula. So here we see strong ethnic nationalism and the ongoing division between the North and South as factors in exacerbating this kind of a desire to be independent of the United States, to be able to stand up to the United States, to bond together among Koreans ourselves. I mentioned this yesterday, but this notion of 민족, one country, one nation, by Koreans ourselves, in being autonomous and being able to talk back to the big powers. This is a very potent force that can disrupt democracy, that can have a negative impact on the bilateral alliance. And we see, for example, in the joint statement that came out of the first round this year of high-level meetings between the North and South on January 9th, it's a 3-paragraph long joint statement, but the word 민족 is mentioned 4 times. And in English, the translation is rather benign into Korean cooperation, but it means much, much more than that. There is the undercurrent of standing up to the big powers, including, or in particular, the United States. And I don't think Americans truly get that.
I think just quickly on that, I think it's true that I don't think the U.S. Fully understands this potency of this ethnic nationalism. But even though the administration has caught on with North Korea mentioning the nuclear weapons are for the U.S. and it's not for the South Korea, and this kind of recent rhetoric coming out and focusing on an ethnic aspect of it, this 우리민족끼리. So I think the administration is at least watching for them and go, what are the North Koreans doing here? So at least North Koreans are hinting at it, and we're not completely missing it. But your point is absolutely valid.
And along those lines, I think North Korea plays up the sort of common Korean themes, and we've seen it in the New Year's Day speech every year. What seemed different this year was not only the mention of the Olympics, because obviously it's only happening this year, but that President Moon Jae-in seemed to grasp at the olive branch that's included in every New Year's Day speech. He grasped at it more quickly than his predecessors in order, I think, to ensure a provocation-free Olympics. But as we've seen in those New Year's Day speeches and others, sort of this, to our compatriots in the South, we can work things out if only you would get rid of those meddlesome, Americans and the alliance and the military exercises. It's that, the peninsula can be free from crisis if we just work, amongst ourselves only on the peninsula. And with the views towards the alliance, there, as there are differences sort of by generation. The elder generation, was always the most supportive of the alliance and the relationship with the U.S. because for them, the forming event was the war and then the U.S. support for rebuilding Korea. The younger generation, the 386 generation, was kind of the crystallizing moment was Gwangju and questions about whether the U.S. was involved or the U.S. was supporting on the crackdown. And then now the younger generation, more conservative, though perhaps with a small c and not necessarily, going for the conservative party, but more skeptical or suspicious of North Korea, more skeptical of engaging, more likely to see the North as a different country rather than the northern half of their own country. So even just polling on support for unification tends to be fairly volatile, but overall, I think there's been a declining support for unification, and it's least supported by the younger generation.
You see, in other parts of the world, in other advanced democracies, ethnic nationalism may be a dirty phrase. But in the Korean Peninsula, ethnic nationalism is sacrosanct. You can't question it. It's the most virtuous value. It's taboo to be against it, and it is a potent factor. It's what Koreans desire, and this tendency to lay the blame on the United States for not doing more to address problems that are inherently Korean problems, for example, winning independence, protecting democracy, human rights, Gwangju. Of course, the U.S. has been blamed for the Gwangju massacre by generations of South Koreans. It really betrays this continuing, persisting what I would call dependence mentality, even going back to 1905, the so-called Taft-Katsura betrayal, and that refers to the meeting between Secretary of War William Howard Taft and the Japanese Prime Minister Katsura in Tokyo in July 1905. There was really no quid pro quo, give and take. Each said, we will stay out of your business. Japan's interests in the Korean Peninsula, American interests in the Philippines. So there was no sinister, under the table kind of deal, and it was not a treaty. But to this day, I would say a lot of South Koreans remain convinced that the U.S. Threw South Korea under the bus, betrayed South Korea in violation of the 1882 treaty between the two countries. The very first article states that both parties, when the other faces external threat, will show its good offices to bring about an amicable resolution at the earliest possible date, thus showing friendly feelings. Basically, it's meaningless diplomatic verbiage. It's not committal, it's not binding, but Koreans feel that the U.S. had signed on to protecting Korea, and betrayed Korea, and the U.S. partitioned the Korean peninsula very callously. There's certainly truth in that, but one contrarian question might be, why wouldn't the U.S. have imposed its will, advanced its interests in the Korean peninsula in 1945? Most Koreans say, why didn't the U.S. just grant self-government, self-rule? Well, it could have, but as the principal victor in the war, why would it have? And the fact that the U.S. did not do more to promote democracy in South Korea through successive authoritarian governments, and that the United States is to this day viewed widely as at least complicit in the massacre of civilians in Gwangju in 1980. These myths are very hard to dismantle.
I have a question. Can I just
Sure.
ask a
You
follow-up
ask a
question to
question,
Dr. Lee? I absolutely agree with you in terms of the ethnic nationalism. Even for the younger generation, I think nationalism is very, very strong. But I wonder, per Bruce's comment about the younger generation and ethnic nationalism, does that translate to North Korea? Because I feel like they are more and more seeing themselves as a South Korean, and that's why they wanted to, play under the South Korean flag and not unified flag and not have the joint hockey team and so on. Do they see, what's North Koreans to them? And this is why when you see the polling on unification, the younger generation is more and more, it's like, we don't care about unification. Who are these people? They could be just somebody else. So I wonder, in terms of ethnic nationalism, does it translate, where does the North Korea play to the South Korean younger generation? South Korea.
This came up yesterday, but I could be wrong. But I feel the reason that the younger generation of South Koreans today are less excited by the prospects for inter-Korean unity and all that is not because they are so apathetic to North Korea. And in the main, of course, South Koreans remain rather indifferent to North Korea, especially in terms of North Korea's egregious human rights violations. But more so because the younger generation, have not yet had a taste of inter-Korean unity, the euphoria of feeling good when it comes to any kind of dramatic encounters between the North and South. The younger generation grew up seeing for themselves the torpedoing of the Cheonan in March 2010, the shelling of the inhabited island Yeonpyeongdo later that year, and this banner ballistic missile year that Kim Jong-un had last year. So they have not yet been tainted with, or they have not had a taste of the workers' paradise in terms of positive dynamics. But once they do, they could change. I think, this notion that Koreans are victims, we've been victimized repeatedly throughout history by the big powers in the region, and these dynamics will go on perhaps forever, and that we can at times say no, we can at times stand up together, united between the Koreans. That's like a very powerful drug. Kim Il-sung, when he was president, said, 민족 is more important than alliance. And no one dissented.
Let me ask you, the Americans in the studio audience or viewing or listening online are are certainly aware of the schisms in Washington now and our national divisions. But perhaps we have a little less knowledge of those divisions in Korea. What do you make of the state of play between the left and the right, and where is that going?
Well, as it's common within North Korea watcher communities, we take a look at the same event, same data, and oftentimes we reach diametrically opposed conclusions. The left and the right, this violent pendular swing with each election cycle means that any overture by, say, the glamorous princess from Pyongyang, Kim Yo-jong, by the way, whose daytime job is the head of the Department of Propaganda and Agitation. She is the chief royal censor. Her job is to make sure that the North Korean people are utterly deprived of information from the outside world so that her brother, so that the royal family could remain in power in perpetuity. But she flashes that mysterious smile, and the left says, well, this is an unexpected dramatic opening. We have to seize upon this opportunity. The right says this is all a ploy, predetermined. We've seen this before. We have to watch out. And that voice, the latter voice, doesn't really resonate nearly as powerfully as the former, because North Korea is able to completely impose a new reality on South Korea and much of the world by putting on a softer face. It's brilliant propaganda. It's hard to imagine that Kim Jong-un just woke up on New Year's Day and decided, hey, I'm going to be a nice guy from now on. It was all pre-planned and entirely predictable. People say North Korea is so unpredictable. I think what they mean is North Korea is unconventional. They're different, but they're approximately predictable. So the princess from Pyongyang, if she were to make a trans-Pacific journey and come and visit Washington, and you're thinking that's crazy. But do you remember that Vice Marshal, the number 2 man in the military, next only to Kim Jong-il, came to the United States in October 2000? Just think of what Kim Yo-jong can achieve if she were to come. Jo Myung-lok, he did a lot, and Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, reciprocated with a visit to Pyongyang just 3 weeks later in 2000. But if Kim Yo-jong were to come and to meet President Trump and carry a message of peace and perhaps a very high bill for aid, I don't want to say it would be game over, but it would be very hard to resist that and not give North Korea concessions, economic and political concessions.
I'll just push back a little bit on that, just because I think this administration in particular is deeply skeptical of North Korea, deeply cynical about Kim Jong-un regime and his intention, his goal. You even saw, that's why we're trying to counter North Korea's message. You saw President Trump's State of Union address, where 50% of his speech, foreign policy portion, was dedicated to North Korea. And most of that was on focusing on the depravity of the Kim Jong-un regime, or the human rights issue. He had an entire family of Otto Warmbier. He had a defector there, he was shaking with the crutch. Then you saw Mr. Trump inviting 8 defectors to the Oval Office on Friday. You saw Vice President talking about doing more sanctions, or coming up with even more new sanctions when he was in Tokyo. He invited Otto Warmbier's father as his special guest. He got criticized for not standing up, for not cheering, for ignoring Kim Yo-jong. And so
but I remember a U.S. president, the one that you work for, calling North Korea part of axis of evil in his State of the Union address in 2002, saying things like, I loathe Kim Jong-il, calling Kim Jong-il a pygmy.
Yes, I remember that.
Inviting North Korean defectors to the White House for the very first time, not just on one occasion, but a few times. And despite his strong ideological hostility toward North Korea, going in a very different direction and making many, many concessions once North Korea escalated with its first nuclear test on the eve of Party Founding Day on October 9th, 2006, returning to negotiations, resuming food aid, removing North Korea from the state sponsors of terrorism list, even having North Korea's dirty money at Banco Delta Asia wire transferred through the New York Federal Reserve Bank upon North Korea's insistence, thus telling the world this is no longer dirty, tainted money, in violation of several U.S. codes, turning a blind eye to North Korea having built a nuclear reactor in Syria, making all kinds of concessions for somebody who was so skeptical of North Korea. So I think the bigger a headache North Korea becomes, and it will, the option of settling for an expedient deal, getting North Korea out of the headlines for a few months, I think will always remain a rational choice for any U.S. administration.
I completely understand what Professor Lee is talking about, but because we went through that whole process, well, it's true, President Bush called North Korea part of axis of evil, famous State of Union address in February 2002. But because we went through that process, and now I'm just telling you, this administration is deeply, deeply skeptical. And so I do think there's just an extra hurdle. It's not going to be so easy for North Koreans. This is why
they have the secret weapon, Kim Yo-jong.
Okay, well, I think they understood that. This is why Vice President Pence did not even stand up. He got criticized for his treatment, how he behaved in Seoul, how he didn't clap when the joint team walked in, and all of this. I think because Americans are understanding of what North Koreans are up to, so they are trying to counter that propaganda message. So I understand everything Professor Lee is saying. I'm just saying it's more difficult today because we already went through that process with President Bush, and we do have an extremely more hardline administration that actually does not think that any good can come out of North Korea through engagement. I'm just at least that could change, but that is the current position.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think another factor is Congress, in that because we've gone through 4 international agreements where North Korea promised never to build nuclear weapons and they collapsed, 4 subsequent agreements to give up what they promised never to build, they collapsed. Right now, Congress is extremely skeptical, to say the least, about engaging with North Korea. And what we've seen during the last 2 U.S. administrations is Congress pushing both the Obama and Trump administrations to more fully enforce U.S. law by passing additional legislation, in a way removing the discretion that a president has to not enforce U.S. law. And what I find so striking in that legislation is at a time when Republicans and Democrats can't seem to agree on what day of the week it is, when we saw those bills passed, it was by votes of like 408 to 2 in the House of Representatives and 96 to 0 in the Senate. And then a year later, it was, I think, 419 to 1 and 98 to 0. Just really, mind-blowing bipartisanship, agreement on the need to punish North Korea for its repeated violations and of the resolutions as well as U.S. law. So I think even if the administration wanted to make a deal, and this president sees himself as a great deal maker, I think Congress would be quite an impediment. Certainly if there was any money that had to be appropriated for benefits provided to North Korea, but I think it would be quite a counterweight to, if we were to go down the path with the president and the princess.
I'd like to press Professor Lee a little bit more on the Korean domestic situation and opinions of the polity. We spoke yesterday about the Candlelight Movement, and generally those of us up here were sharing fairly positive impressions of what was a dramatic and peaceful movement that proportionally, given the huge crowds of up to 2 million on some weekends, and for such a long period during the cold weather, consider that percentage relative to an American public that was out protesting. Quite interesting, and we did mention the myriad causes beyond Park Geun-hye's ouster that was being called for. But it was certainly a period of some confusion and some trial, and the Olympics in some ways has shown Korea now as more solid, more unified, South Korea out front, and of course the glamour of the technology and its premier brands on display and its role as host and hub have provided a very strong shine to perspectives on South Korea. How do you think, South Koreans balance, as much as we've talked about North Korea, balance these messages, especially about the Minjok, relative to other daily concerns and this jobs issue and household debt and other priorities. I mean, what are the expectations that you feel are out there now, and what are the comfort levels relative to the Moon Jae-in administration and moving forward now that Candlelight Movement is beyond us? Behind us, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if North Korea were a conventional nation state, well-behaved, peaceful, non-threatening, I think the degree of apathy, general apathy for North Korea would be even higher in the South. No one would really think about North Korea as a factor in domestic politics or in South Korea's relations with the big neighbors in the region. But North Korea has a way of grabbing your attention. And when North Korea does something like fire an ICBM or conduct a nuclear test, as everyone here has observed, South Koreans are unfazed. There's an element of denialism, and it's entirely understandable on one level that a society cannot function if it lives in constant fear of war. At the same time, what that kind of apathy or indifference translates into is that there is complacent mentality that they're not going to do this, they don't mean us any harm, that they are just poor, clamoring for attention, some aid. It's not a big deal, and Americans are actually the problem, warmongers. They are making things worse by threatening war, by even devising a plan B of preemptive strike, which of course goes back to 1993 and 1994 when Ashton Carter, when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense, spent about 6 months working on these issues doing war game scenarios. And the conclusion reached, as everyone knows, was that this is simply too risky. It would be a self-defeating proposition to take out the nuclear reactor in Yongbyon. I'm sure the administration today is aware of that, but because North Korea has grown into a bigger and imminent threat, there is more willingness to talk about preemptive strike. But at the same time, I feel that the checks and balances, the sense of self-preservation, not to defeat oneself in a humanitarian disaster, that would be another war in the Korean Peninsula, these deterrence mechanisms are still in place today, despite the strong rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration. So South Koreans see North Korea as a problem, yes, but the U.S. role in the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. factor even more as an impediment to genuine inter-Korean reconciliation and unification. That is the view, the stated view of the far left. The U.S. is the imperialist power hindering, blocking Korean unification. But if you water that down a little bit, it sort of resonates among the general public too. The U.S. is creating the problems. It's not North Korea, it's the United States, and that is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about democracy and information flows relative to this conversation. Since Bruce noted the developments on the Hill and the enforcement that has tightened in the last year, one of the areas for increased funding is information broadcasts. We know that there's a very active South Korean movement to get information over the DMZ or into North Korea in other ways, through disk drives, etc. We had Jun Baek here to talk about North Korea's information revolution. Do any of the three of you have feelings about where we are with this? And we're starting to hear reports that information is becoming more pervasive within North Korea and may ultimately drive people to be more aware.
Well, I'm actually a huge proponent of information warfare. I think whatever policy options we pursue in North Korea, I think this is trying to get information into North Korea should be in place. I don't think we have a robust one. I know it keeps coming up, but I know that at least on the Congress, this is more of a subject because we, like people like Bruce and myself, and whenever we have an opportunity, I think we talk about it among others. And so I know at least there is an acceptance or awareness in the administration, at least with the senators and congressmen, that there's more. We need to do more on that front and try to get information into North Korea. Because when you look at it in terms of longer strategy, despite, with the sanctions and secondary sanctions and pressure, this has to continue. And I think even when people like Tae-Yong came to testify, he talked about that. So I think it's resonating in the Hill. And even in more targeted information, not just blanket information with balloons just going into North Korea, but how do we get targeted information into North Korea? That's a little bit different to the public and to the elites, right? Because message to elites is different. It could be, twofold. The message to elites is one, hey, if you keep this policy that Kim Jong-un is pursuing, this path, it's not a way for their survival, the elite's survival, their family, their children, and so on. And secondly, should they defect or should they want to leave North Korea, there is some sort of amnesty, there's some sort of alternate life that's available for them. So it's more smart messaging to the elites, to the public, and I think there's just greater awareness. This just has to be a policy, regardless of whether we're pursuing engagement or dialogue or sanctions or pressure.
The budget requested for this year for Korean language service for Radio Free Asia and Voice of America is smaller than those requested for Tibetan, Burmese, Indonesian, and Mandarin Chinese. And these are all very important issues unto themselves. But for a human rights problem, North Korea, which has no parallel in the contemporary world, according to that landmark UN Commission of Inquiry report, to appropriate just a few $1 million for Korean language services targeting North Korea to try to open up North Korea with information, facts about the outside world is kind of regrettable.
Yeah, I agree. When I've talked with congressional staffers or members of Congress, we always try to push information operations, both overt and covert, as one of the lanes in the road of a overall comprehensive integrated strategy towards North Korea. And there's great receptivity to it. And, I think they're looking for ideas. I think I agree that there should be greater funding for it. And different, outside groups are, advocating new tools to try to get information in and out. So whether it's broadcasting via drones flying along the DMZ or the maritime borders, whether it's thumb drives and disk drives, or using the existing Egyptian Orascom cell phone network, trying to piggyback off that frequency, for getting communication into the South. Any number of other ways, whether it's innovative or more traditional ways. So, what I often find though is sort of a division between those who are favoring, say, whatever you want to say, overt or soft engagement, sports teams, philharmonics, et cetera, saying, and they advocate that as a way of getting information in and out so that we see that the North Korean people are not robots, that they love their children, which of course they do. It's the regime we have a problem with, not the people themselves. But so those who favor the soft side of engagement, because information exchange is good, often seem to blanch when we talk about, well, let's use covert means or means that the North Korean regime doesn't like, whether it's getting information in via whatever means. And they'll say, well, no, we don't want to upset the regime, or we don't want to incite unrest. It's like, well, information is information. You should be in favor of both sides, both the hard and the soft side of information operations.
There is a strong tendency to exercise self-deterrence, self-censorship when it comes to information operations. We don't want to provoke the regime by doing all this. We don't want the regime to feel even more paranoid and go berserk, lash out. So let's cut back on these information operations. It's a very misplaced way of looking at things, in my humble opinion.
Before we turn to our audience and their questions, I just wanted to close this formal part of the session with mention of your comments yesterday about 30 years from now, looking 30 years ahead. And we do have some new additions here in our studio audience, and I'm certain online. Did you want to expand a bit more? Where in 30 years do you think this process might be?
South Korea will remain a democracy, a more mature, more developed democracy, but it's hard to imagine that South Korea's development over the next 30 years will be as dramatic as that over the past 30 years because of this great, this spurt of growth economically, politically, in terms of civil liberties over the past 3 decades is hard to replicate. As we see in the case of the evolution of democracy in America, it was only a few decades ago when women and minorities didn't have the right to vote. There has been tremendous development, of course, in the United States in terms of safeguarding civil liberties and other principles of democracy. But this is a very slow, gradual pace. It's glacially slow in some ways. So I believe South Korea will continue to evolve as a stronger democracy, but these dramatic contrasts 30 years from now will be less apparent. Where will North Korea be 30 years from now? I guess we don't know.
No
And
unification in 30 years?
If there is integration, what about that challenge for democracy?
Oh, you mean if there is to be
Integration or
a
unification?
change in the status quo? I believe it will take more than a century for there to be genuine reconciliation among the Korean people, the people of the North and the South, because of the huge ideological gulf that exists between the Korean people in the North and the South, because of the deeply entrenched biases that mainstream South Korean elites and society at large have toward North Koreans, because North Koreans are just underprivileged. Almost, it's like plucking somebody out of the 1950s and throwing them in the ultra-competitive society that is South Korea today. For there to be genuine cultural, economic, national reconciliation, it's going to take many years. That's a big challenge for the Korean people. And again, it's an inherently Korean problem, and Korea will need help. At the same time, that kind of challenge will be worth it. It would be far more meaningful than living with the status quo. For unification will mean a second Korean liberation. Liberation for over 25 million people living north of the border. Bondage from enslavement.
I would just say we look at the situation now, we don't like it. The status quo is reprehensible, having half of the Korean people under such a brutal regime. It's, as if we're on one side of a swamp. We look to the other side of the swamp and we see, the vision we hope for is a peacefully unified Korean peninsula, living under freedom and democracy and free market principles and respect for law and human rights, all of which exist in the South but not in the North. We want to get to that happy place on the other side of the swamp. But to get there is, there are a lot of unforeseeable dangers in the swamp between here and there. And so as unsatisfactory as the status quo is, there's a hesitancy to try to induce the unification to get there to the other side of the swamp. So whether it's through preventive attack or forced unification. So I think that's why there's a sort of an intent to have a slow unification, trying to bring about a change in the North, not through a sudden regime change, but more through trying to create the conditions for change. It's unsatisfactory. We want to get to that other side, but there's that hesitancy or the reluctance or the concern about what it might take to get there. But I certainly hope, someday that we no longer have a demilitarized zone. We don't have, this gash across the peninsula dividing the Korean people. But thinking of how to get there is very difficult.
Thank you. Let's turn now to your questions or thoughts, comments. Please just identify yourself and your affiliation
raise your
for
hand.
those who are streaming online and speaking to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Hugh Dugan. I'm a retired State Department and currently professor at Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy, and just returned from the Olympic Games. And it might be interesting to know that the leadership of the Olympic movement shared that it was only 4 hours before opening ceremonies that they had agreed to have the joint procession into the stadium. My question is that the 1988 Seoul Games went far to change South Korea. And I wonder what change we might see from the Pyeongchang Games on the peninsula in general. What big change might we see out of these games for the peninsula? And if you could script the one big thought delivered at the closing ceremonies, what would that be? Thank you.
I think you'll see two dynamics at the closing ceremonies. One will be a push for durability to this inter-Korean relations process. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the North and South announce specific dates for military-to-military talks to try to create an Olympic movement beyond the Games. I think secondly is more of a regional reality, which is the torch will be passed from Pyeongchang to Beijing, and so there will be an interesting capstone relative to South Korea's relations with China, which have been troubled for 2 years now, although there have been moves in recent months to put that behind, and clearly Chinese participation now at the Games is active. And there has been much said about confidence building in terms of bringing Japanese and Chinese athletes for special trials, in terms of linking Pyeongchang 2018 to Tokyo 2020 and Beijing 2022. So there may be some very positive movement by way of regional dynamics in an atmosphere where, aside from the Korean regional tensions, clearly China and Japan are trying to get their relations to a healthier point. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But there may be some other opinions too.
The big difference I see between now and 30 years ago, when South Korea held that coming out party, the '88 Olympics, South Koreans were very insecure, sensitive, overly so, about how they were perceived, seen by the outside world. Today, South Koreans are much more self-assured, proud, and confident. At the same time, today, South Korea is even more psychologically dependent on Pyongyang. That is, South Korea is now even more beholden to North Korea's goodwill because South Korea has had a taste of inter-Korean projects, inter-Korean summit meetings. If North Korea dangles an olive branch in front of South Korea, then South Koreans are galvanized to pursue that course of peacemaking. So in a strange way, as South Korea has tried to engage the North remains rather unchanged in fundamental ways. The North Koreans have not backed down on their nuclear missile programs or their human rights atrocities, whereas South Korea has become arguably more changed than the target of engagement itself. And I think we're seeing North Korea's propaganda game. North Korea's really gamed up its propaganda. And this is not entirely new. As I briefly mentioned, in 2000, North Korea sent a special envoy to the United States. In 1972, Kim Il-sung invited reporters from the New York Times, from the Washington Post. Kim Il-sung took out very expensive full-page ads in the New York Times, in the Times of London, in the Washington Post between 1969 and 1975, and also thereafter, all to make the point that as the US was hopelessly losing the war in Vietnam, globally seen as an unjust war, Kim Il-sung very deftly argued that the presence of US troops in South Korea is unjust. It's a colonial occupation and likely to lead to another war, just like Vietnam, so they must go right away. And that message that the US is the aggressor and North Korea is but a small, bumbling, but basically well-meaning, peaceful nation, that central message actually resonated all over the world. My point being, North Korea's propaganda game, as compared with their game decades ago, today is far more sophisticated. It's more effective in unleashing the sister. North Korea has shown that it can really, really touch the hearts and minds of unsuspecting, gullible people all over the world.
And while I wouldn't deny Professor Lee his points there. I tend to take a much more optimistic message about some of this, and I think that the United States needs to provide maximum room for South Korea to try this inter-Korean relation process and to accept failures that may well be expected along the way. Nobody here is naive about the realities of this. Nobody is naive about North Korea propaganda making. However, the Olympics do represent a movement. And were there any durability, and I think while you may say it's not probable, it is possible. If there is durability to this process, it would be one of the more distinguished aspects of the legacy of the Games. And so we can hope for that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with hoping. Sumi invoked, Yonsei in 1987, 88, where I also spent time, and yesterday I also noted an exhibition I had seen up at Ewha Women's University at the time, and there's a lot of hope and there was a lot of doubt as well at that time. So again, not to be naive, but I think we should be providing maximum room. One of the benefits of these two great democracies, the United States and South Korea, that enjoy a great alliance is that is, as Sumi pointed out, a strong reality. And I think the strength of that alliance is in allowing room for your alliance partner to manage a process that may lead to failure, that will be incredibly difficult, where people will point fingers and say that one may be duped, but if we don't try, we get nowhere. Phil, please.
Philip Sherman, I'm a member of the Korea Society. The purpose of the American-Korean alliance is to defend the Republic of Korea. The worry that and when I say defending the Republic of Korea, what I mean is defending a liberal industrial democracy that has all the accoutrements of democratic process, civil rights, administrations get kicked out in elections, and so on and so forth. I think it's understandable that South Korea, the Republic of Korea, doesn't want to get blown up in a war. Who wouldn't? Who would, rather. But the concern that would be on my mind is that I don't get as much of a signal as I think would be a good idea from South Korea, that South Korea said, look, we're a democracy, and that's where we want to stay. I hear a lot about accommodating and princesses and all that kind of stuff, but I hear very little about who we are. And it seems to me, as I said yesterday, that I think democracy has become a part of Republic of Korea nationalism. And I think Korea, the Republic, needs to stand up a little bit more as to say who it is, and not just trying to make nice with Kim III.
Yeah, I might say perhaps they feel they don't need to articulate it because the democracy is now so ingrained in the Republic of Korea. And I think what we've seen, some of the pushback domestically in South Korea against some of President Moon's initiatives. The fairness issue came up yesterday of, kicking off, I believe it was 6 South Korean hockey players from the women's team in order to accommodate the North. That resonated very strongly, I think, with the South Korean public. So there's that, I think, the sense that the Koreans know who they are, perhaps don't feel they have to articulate that they're not going to assimilate themselves into North Korea. And I do think President Moon has a number of domestic constraints on how far he can go in engagement.
One of the purposes of our exercise was to show Americans what the Republic of Korea is like. Mm-hmm. It's a democracy that we should be pleased and willing to defend. That Koreans know about themselves is good, but I think other people need to be sharing the secret.
Well, I think along those lines, President Trump's speech to the National Assembly, in watching it, at first I thought, well, he's speaking to South Koreans and he's going into great detail on the miracle of South Korea. It's, they know that. But when I talked to South Koreans afterwards, they said they were very appreciative of it, because obviously he was speaking to more than just the people in the National Assembly building. So he went on, I thought at great length, appropriate length, commending South Korea for its journey. So, as I said, the South Koreans were very appreciative of that, of recognizing their journey, how far they've come from where they were in such a short amount of time. And then he also discussed the North Korean human rights atrocities. So, I think that was a very good thing for President Trump to do, is to articulate, and obviously the U.S. audience would also be following it. For those who don't work Korea every day, who perhaps aren't aware to the detail all of us in the audience and on the dais are, how far South Korea has come and what an impressive country it is now. So, I think it's also up to the U.S. to articulate that. And the Olympics is a good time to do it.
Yeah. And Phil, I share your enthusiasm. I think a great deal of what we should be talking about is proliferation, in terms of the proliferation of the models like South Korea of democracy, especially in a globe where we see neo-authoritarian tendencies, where we've seen rollbacks to democracy, and a benefit of things like the work of COICA that sends South Korea, which has the second largest Peace Corps in the world, only to the United States. Those are young people who are there and who are spreading a message and presenting an example. And clearly, Korea has been very active through the National Assembly, through the executive, at educating those from nation democracies. I know they've had a healthy relationship with Taiwan from the time of their development on democratic issues. When I lived in Mongolia for 3 years, Mongolian parliamentarians and civil society members were coming to South Korea for conferences and for education campaigns on how to adjust to democratic realities. And that's incredibly, incredibly important. It was one of the messages I think we heard in the conversation between George W. Bush and Victor Cha at our gala here. And it's been, I think, an aspect of Korea that, as you well said, needs to be voiced more with appreciation in the international community, with reinforcement. Some of my South Korean students say, "What's the big deal?" And I say, you know what, in a historical perspective, and in such a relatively short time, it is a big deal. And sure, it's a cumbersome process, and it's complicated, and it may see strong disagreements in the National Assembly and elsewhere. But so was the American, and has been the American experience. And at least we have common values there in democracy that are all important and that may carry the torch for freedom and may relieve North Korea someday of its burden.
And to both of your points, so when people are asking the alliance, is it supposed to be based on strategy or value? I do think this is why we need to continually upgrade and expand the alliance, not to just dealing with North Korea, but it's really a partnership, right? It's a partnership that's based on values like democracy, like market economy, like respect for law and human rights, and global partnership on working on a whole host of issues, from peacekeeping to space to cyber proliferation, all whole host. So that's why I think both capitals recognize the need to continually expand and upgrade the alliance beyond dealing with just the North Korean threat.
Thank you for that, Sumi. One last question.
All right, thank you. Young Kim from Korean Consul General here in New York. I really liked your, analogy of the Game of the Throne. Yeah, we watched the, season 1. Now we are watching season 2, and I also agree that maybe season 3 will start sooner or later. But some of my colleagues in Seoul, in Korean think tanks, have some kind of a little bit different opinion about the North Korean games plan strategy. Maybe before the end of the game, season 2, they may suggest some kind of some proposals, such as maybe we can declare some kind of a moratorium on nuclear test or missile test, or maybe they can offer some kind of partial freeze. Without any kind of on-ground inspection, just kind of, not enriched uranium, just plutonium site of the Yongbyon. Maybe they can, by doing so, they can make season 3 even more, interesting, even more violent. So my question is, what would be the response from the U.S. side if North Korea really suggests this kind of some seemingly attractive, proposals to the United States before decision 2?
All right. Well, I'm glad you like the Game of Thrones analogy. When I used it on TV, the announcer said, "Oh, I've never watched the show." It sort of was like when I was on BBC TV and I was using a baseball analogy to talk about missile defense, and the announcer said, "Well, I'm sure that's quite correct, Mr. Klingner, but we don't play baseball here, we play cricket." So anyway, at least someone liked the analogy. We focused before the Olympics on a freeze-for-freeze option or variations. And I think the majority of the Korea watchers in Washington are against the idea. We point out the disparity. And the freeze-for-freeze is usually the U.S. and South Korea don't do their military exercises in return for North Korea not doing missile or nuclear tests. And we point out, well, we're allowed to do military exercises. They're not allowed to do missile tests. And not only the tests are a violation, but the continued existence of their nuclear and missile programs are themselves violations of the UN resolutions. And they do a winter training cycle and a summer training cycle, military exercises, which no one seems to mention. And the winter training cycle is going on now. It usually culminates in a core level exercise in March or so. Maybe this year, because of fuel shortages, it's going to be smaller. But trading something legal for illegal doesn't make sense. So I think that would not gain a lot of traction. At least in the U.S., I think there's been a pushback. And indeed, the Trump administration has repeatedly said they're not interested in a freeze-for-freeze. Now, if there's, some other proposal, I guess we'll have to evaluate that.
Bruce, as we head into Major League Baseball spring training, I would point out that the United States, Korea, and Japan are all strong baseball nations. Mm-hmm. And as our friend Mark Lippert would say, go Doosan, Bears. I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and especially to thank Bruce, Sumi Terry, and Sung-Yoon Lee for their eloquence. We appreciate your time both yesterday and today.
The conclusion of the event heard suggestion of the essential nature of South Korea's democracy, its example, and its counter to broader trends toward authoritarianism today. A special thank you to the Korea Foundation for its continued support of society programs, Philip Sherman and family for their generosity, and the scholars and analysts who joined. Special thanks as well to producers Peter and Jonathan and the entire staff of the Korea Society. The Korea Society, celebrating 60 years as an independent American nonprofit educating Americans on Korea and Northeast Asia.